next guest is a remarkable woman, dedicated not only to preserving Africa's wildlife, but also making sure humans and animals survive and thrive together. She was born in 1970, just as Idi Amin's brutal regime was about to take power in Uganda. Her father was abducted and murdered by his forces when she was just 2 years old. Uganda's first wildlife vet, Dr. Gladys Kalema Zikusoka, realized early in her life that wildlife conservation does not happen in a vacuum. It has to embrace the surrounding human population as well, and often navigate its way through conflict. Her book, Walking with Gorillas, The Journey of an African Wildlife Vet, was published in June this year, and she joins us in studio now. Doctor, it's an absolute honor to have you in the studio. Your book is magnificent. Your story is phenomenal. Let's start at the beginning. Your own father, he was a cabinet minister in Milton Obote's government, of course, before Idi Amin came into power. He was murdered when you were just 2 years old by Idi Amin's forces. Before him in 1945, your maternal grandfather, who was, I think, best to describe it as a regional prime minister in Uganda, he was assassinated. So I wonder how that context shaped your worldview and your desire to help wildlife rather than, say, go into politics.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on the show. Yes, our family was, my family background has had a lot of tragedy. My grandfather wanted to really develop the country, and he was assassinated because he was trying to encourage people to sell land to create the University of East Africa, which eventually became Makerere University. And that was my mom's dad. And then when she married somebody who also wanted to develop the country. And so sadly, my dad was one of the first victims in the President Idi Amin era. But when I was old enough to understand, because I was only 2 years old and I don't remember my dad, but when I was old enough to understand, I felt like I wanted to continue his legacy and his dream of a prosperous Uganda, but through my passion for animals and wildlife.
It's beautiful. How has conflict affected wildlife in Africa? I mean, I know that's a very broad question, but there's some very specific examples. I mean, you mentioned in the book that Idi Amin basically encouraged people to poach.
Yes.
But of course, we know what the Rwandan conflict did in that country. So just talk to me about some of the most stark examples of what happens to animals when there's conflict.
What happens to animals when there's conflict is they try and run away from the conflict. So for example, when we had conflict in Uganda and a lot of poaching in the parks in the 70s, animals migrated to DRC. And then when there's conflict in DRC, they can migrate to Uganda, such as elephants. And you find that in the Virungas, when there's fighting down there, the gorillas tend to go up in the mountain. But yeah, no, conflict has been something that really affects wildlife conservation efforts. For example, we're trying to do also some work, some of the work that we're doing in Uganda, we're trying to scale up to the DRC, but it's often hindered by conflict in the DRC.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, animals don't respect human borders, and the mountain gorillas often crossed over from Uganda into then Zaire.
Yes.
Is there enough cooperation amongst leaders in that region around the importance of preserving animals and wildlife?
I believe there is actually. I can say that, there's the East African community and they meet regularly, and within it there's Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya, Tanzania, South Sudan, Burundi. They meet regularly to talk about issues. And also regarding the mountain gorilla specifically, there are some initiatives such as the Greater Virunga Transboundary Collaboration, where they try and get the governments of Uganda, Rwanda, and Democratic Republic of Congo to all of us to have the same kind of regulations to the gorillas. So for example, now everyone has to wear masks when they visit the gorillas. We try and make it that the experience is the same for the tourists and they're receiving the same protection when they move within the 3 countries.
I mean, it's so interesting, and this I think is where your concept of One Health emerged, when you realized that I think it was mountain gorillas who were getting scabies probably from indirect human contact.
Yes, the mountain gorillas, one of the first cases I had as Uganda's first wildlife vet is I was called in and told the gorillas are losing hair and developing white scaly skin. And when we went in and found out it was scabies, It was tragic. We lost an infant, but the rest recovered with ivermectin treatment. And we started to ask ourselves, where did it come from? And they're often going outside the park to eat people's banana plants. And people put out dirty clothing on scarecrows to chase away gorillas, baboons, and other wildlife. And that's probably how they got the scabies. But it made me realize that you can't keep the gorillas healthy without improving the health of their human neighbors. And so that set me on it was a turning point in my life when we decided to start a One Health approach to conservation.
Yeah, and tell me more about that, because so often, especially in areas that are very poor, people rely on bushmeat, for example, just to feed themselves.
Yes.
Was it difficult to say to someone who was living on the poverty line or below it, look, you actually need these animals and you two can work together to make a healthy environment? And how did you do that?
I would say that it was easier for the areas that were already benefiting from tourism. The local community understood that if they were going to benefit from tourists visiting gorillas, the gorillas had to remain healthy. So from a very early on in my career, they really valued the contribution I was making to make sure the gorillas keep healthy. And so then when we started the initiative of conservation through public health, they got even more excited. Because I remember one of the rangers telling me, thank you, Dr. Gladys, for helping the community, because by improving their health, you're making them feel like you really care about them. It's not just the forest and the gorillas. And so that's how it's really been able to be possible.
Of course, you know, if I think of South Africa, we have rhino poaching, and that is a criminal element that is actually exporting the goods. And very often, yes, we do have sometimes local people involved, but it's often such a bigger syndicate.
Yes.
How do you make a breakthrough then? Can the community, which, as you say, by and large, wants to embrace sort of local tourism, how can they withstand perhaps an international syndicate trying to poach rhino horn?
I would say that the situation at Bwindi is very unique. In Uganda, people are really being lifted out of poverty because of tourism. Some of the money from the park entry fee and $10 from every permit goes to support community efforts. Most of the people are hired from the local community, and they can sell crafts and accommodation and food. So it's really transformed their lives, and that makes a huge difference. And I think in South Africa, the local communities have to benefit enough from protecting wildlife that they won't get taken away to destroy wildlife. And that it really has to be a bigger benefit to protect rather than destroy the wildlife.
And I would imagine that process is not a one and done. It's an ongoing commitment to that community.
Yes.
And an ongoing connection. And teaching the community that animals are very, very close to us. I mean, I think you've spoken about how similar chimpanzees are to humans, and that humanity, when you held a chimp and a mountain gorilla, that you realized they were so close to the human species.
Yes, they really are. And that's why with conservation through public health, we improve the health of the people, the gorillas, and other wildlife together, because everybody's dependent on each other. You need healthy animals to keep people healthy, and healthy people to keep animals healthy. It's like a One Health approach, and you can't separate one from the other.
I mean, it's extraordinary what you're doing. There are, of course, boundaries that you've had to overcome, I would imagine, being a woman.
Yes.
But we think, of course, of people like Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey. Those were extraordinary women as well. Were they an inspiration to you in this journey?
They were a great inspiration to me in my journey. I met Dr. Jane Goodall when I was a vet student, and she invited me to Gombe National Park when I attended her talks. And she's been a great mentor to me all these years, and I'm so excited that she's written the foreword for working with gorillas. And she herself also uses, similar methods that we have, caring for the health and well-being of communities to protect the chimpanzees and other wildlife. And the late Dr. Diane Fossey has always been an inspiration. I was too young, I never met her before she died, but I'm glad that I'm continuing some of her legacy with our work at Conservation Through Public Health and working with gorillas.
Jane Goodall says she wrote a wonderful foreword for your book, and she said that your story is truly inspiring, of how one determined and dedicated woman overcame many setbacks and faced many dangers to follow and realize her dreams. You've achieved so much, Doctor, but what's the next challenge? What are you focused on now? I mean, are the populations of mountain gorillas safe now, or is there more work to be done there, or perhaps there's another area that you need to focus on?
Yes, we've done as much as possible to keep things going. I would say that the population of mountain gorillas, we're really excited that the numbers are continuing to grow. When I first started working with them, there were only about 650, and now there's over 1,000. And because of that, gorillas are no longer critically endangered, they're now endangered. But would love to scale up the same approach to other gorilla habitats so that we can reverse the trend with the eastern lowland, western lowland, and cross-river gorillas. But also the numbers of gorillas are going up and there isn't enough space. So I think the next challenge is how do we provide a larger protected area to accommodate the growing number of mountain gorillas.
Yeah, and of course every area you move into, you're also helping the local community with your One Health concept. Absolutely
Yes.
wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for coming into studio and for your wonderful book. Really inspiring story. That is Uganda's first wildlife vet, Dr. Gladys Kalema Zikusoka. She's author of Walking with Gorillas, The Journey of an African Wildlife Vet. So, amazing story. But up